Excellent. Well, I believe that our webinar is now active, so I will go ahead and get started. Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone on the line, and thank you so much for joining us here today. By way of introduction, my name is Rokeya Helfer, and I'm a board member at MicroLoan Foundation USA. As many of you may know, MicroLoan Foundation works to empower low-income women in Zambia, Zimbabwe, and in Malawi with loans and small business training to help them lift themselves out of poverty. Over 324,000 women have already joined MicroLoan Foundation to begin their own small businesses, which in turn have helped these women enhance their families' access to food, to healthcare, and to education, allowing us to help improve more than 1.6 million lives today. As proud as we are of this work at MicroLoan Foundation, and we are very proud, we know that the circumstances that women in these regions are facing are more challenging and more urgent than ever before. About 90% of the women that we work with are subsistence farmers at the poorest levels of the spectrum, who are particularly vulnerable to the increasingly unpredictable and extreme weather that we're all facing as a result of climate change. That vulnerability can have devastating consequences for the food security of these women and their families, which is why we've assembled this incredible panel here in honor of World Food Day to explore the key challenges and opportunities in adopting more sustainable approaches to agricultural production that can help build food security for millions of smallholder farmers in Africa and really beyond. So I'm really pleased to be joined today by such an esteemed panel of experts for this discussion. And I'd like to start off by giving them the floor to introduce themselves. If I could, I'll first turn it over to Sarah Mbagobunu, the Director of the International Fund for Agricultural Development's East and Southern Africa Division. Sarah, thank you for joining us. And could I ask you to say a few words about yourself?
Thank you very much, Rokeya, and thank you for having me. My name is Sarah Mbagobunu. I am the Regional Director for IFAD, for the International Fund for Agricultural Development for East and Southern Africa. And of course, I am an agriculture economist, actually by background. And of course, I'm very passionate, as IFAD is, around climate action. And I'm very happy to also participate in this conversation because we know that rural communities, small-scale farmers are disproportionately affected, particularly in Africa, to the climate and the climate impacts. So I am currently managing a portfolio of 4.5 billion operations across 22 East and Southern African countries, largely public finance, and I'm really excited to share my experience on this panel. Thank you, and back to you.
Thank you. And next I'll turn to Jack Ngoma, the CEO of MicroLoan Foundation Zambia. Jack, could I ask you to introduce yourself?
Thank you so much, Rokeya. So my name is Jack Ngoma. I'm CEO for MicroLoan Foundation Zambia. MicroLoan is a microfinance institution that is 100% focused on servicing women in rural areas who are largely excluded from financial services. The organization in Zambia is currently serving just over 40,000 plus active women borrowers. In addition, MLF is very active. In addition to its normal business loan, financing of business loans, we are also involved in providing loans for agriculture. This is one of the things that we are doing in our recent portfolio, and we are very, very interested to keep growing. I'm looking forward to participate on this panel and also to hear from other panelists as we discuss through this topic today.
Thank you, Jack. We're also very fortunate to have Dr. Irene Kadzere-Forici on the line from FEBIL. Irene, could I ask you to introduce yourself as well?
Thank you very much, Rokeya. I'm happy to be with you today. And my name is Irene Kadzere-Forici, and I'm currently working as a senior scientist and project coordinator at the Research Institute of Organic Agriculture in Switzerland. I joined FEBIL in 2012, but before then, I was working as a regional emergency agronomist for the United Nations FAO in Southern Africa, and where I was also part of the conservation agriculture working group, where we were mainstreaming conservation agriculture among programs. Within FIBO, my work has spanned across several regions and countries in Africa, looking at comparative research on the productivity, profitability, and sustainability of organic and conventional farming systems, and also capacity development, and also looking at how to link some of these smallholder farmers to markets. I'm passionate about inclusive, holistic, sustainable rural development driven by resilient food systems and livelihoods. And I'm also part of the International Conservation Agriculture Advisory Panel for Africa, which is part of the African Conservation Tillage Network. And I think this ties in well with the topic today. And I'm also very happy that you invited me as part of the celebration to the upcoming World Food Day. Thank you, Rukaya, and others for this opportunity. Back to you, Rukaya.
Thank you so much. And finally, we have Katya Goritz from the Frankfurt School of Finance and Management. Katya, we would love for you to say a few words about yourself for our audience as well.
Sure, thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name is Katja Goertz, and I'm a director at Frankfurt School of Finance and Management in Germany. And I'm leading the work we are doing in terms of promoting access to finance for the agricultural sector, mostly in emerging markets. So we are actually supporting banks and financial institutions to either venture into the agricultural sector or to further increase their footprints. And I personally have most recently also focused more on issues relating to gender in agriculture. And I'm the team leader of a very exciting technical assistance project that we are going to start with MLF Malawi. And I hope I have the chance to tell you much more about it throughout this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Katya. We'll definitely be coming back to that, so I can make sure you'll get that chance. I'm really excited to jump straight into the conversation, and I'm hoping that we can all come away today with a deeper understanding of what climate change means for food security, what the key opportunities and challenges are in building more resilient approaches, and the kind of steps that we should collectively be thinking about from all of our different vantage points, working across gender and financial inclusion and agriculture and international developments more broadly. So to jump straight into it, you know, my first question is, there's a huge volume of people in Africa. I think roughly 65% of Africa's population relies on subsistence farming and smallholder agriculture. And Irene, I wonder if you could tell us a bit about how you're seeing climate change affect subsistence farmers and smallholders in this sector, especially as it relates to the effects that climate change is having on women who are smallholder farmers and working on subsistence.
Yeah, thank you, Rukaya, for this question. I think let me start by pointing at climatic projections by experts on this topic, so that I can then narrow down to the impacts on subsistence farmers, including women. So the experts on climate change show a disproportionate vulnerability of Africa to climate change compared to other regions in the world. And for example, in 2020, they saw that the rate of temperature rise across Africa was actually much greater than the global average. And the African continent experiences many manifestations of weather and climate-related challenges, such as variable rainfall, extreme weather events like floods, droughts, and sometimes a late start to the crop growing season, or sometimes the rains even stop early before the crops mature, and there's increased heat and other problems. There are also some confounding factors to this climate change. We have pandemics like COVID, HIV/AIDS, and malaria, the high food prices. They also come into play. And all this is happening in a continent where the majority really depend on natural resources for their food, nutrition, and overall livelihoods. The ripple effects of these changes and weather adversities include many issues like loss of food, loss of seed, which means planting for the next season might be impacted, then loss of grazing pastures and water for animals, loss of property, loss of incomes, let alone the loss of human lives. And these processes really trigger food and nutrition insecurity, perpetual poverty, and sometimes displacement. And this really derails some of the achievements being made towards national development programs and the sustainable development goals. Due to some of these factors, also taking into consideration the general land degradation and decline in soil fertility, this increasing rate of undernourishment. For example, the UN estimated in 2018 that nearly 257 million people in Africa were undernourished, and the majority of these were in sub-Saharan Africa. But narrowing down now to the impacts of these adversities on women, we know that women in subsistence farming are largely responsible for producing the food, feeding families, among other pressing household chores and social responsibilities. So any adversities that affect the natural resource base upon which the women and their families largely depend on really shakes the foundation of their livelihoods. And such repeated shocks then weaken the women's coping capacities and makes them more vulnerable to future shocks, while also reducing their capacity to provide food for the families immediately. So with droughts or early cessation of rains, we see that productivity can be low. And sometimes this then relates to low yields and harvest. And this limits the choices that the women have in preparing adequate and nutritious meals for their families. We also are aware that most women in the smallholder farming sector have low resource endowment, and they are considered less bankable compared to their male counterparts. So climate change, although it is affecting all communities, women and children are more vulnerable. And yeah, it brings in the real challenges on what the women can really do in order to address these challenges. Access to finance is also another issue because of the limited resources that women have. Yeah, thank you. Back to you, Rokaya.
Thank you very much, Irene. That's, I think, a really sobering reminder of the very real consequences that many of the women who rely on subsistence farming are experiencing in caring for both themselves and their families as a result of these shifts. Sarah, if I could turn to you, beyond the households level, how are you seeing climate change affects food security more broadly across Africa from your work at IFAD?
Thank you, Rokaya. And I think most has already been said in terms of local level impacts by Irene. In fact, climate change has multiple impacts on the ability of Africa's food systems to be responsive. And by that, I mean responsive in terms of the not only nutrition, meeting nutrition requirements with healthy diets, also in terms of creating the much needed jobs for youth, and also in the sense being able to actually just produce adequate numbers of food. We actually see right now that the climate impacts on the Horn of Africa, for instance, in East Africa, there is an ongoing drought in Somalia Djibouti, northern Kenya, and parts of Ethiopia, which is really devastating communities there. The cost of hunger in these areas is over 4.5 billion, and it's really now a humanitarian crisis. So for the government, member governments that we serve as part of the International Fund for Agricultural Development, they are already strained fiscally because of the impacts of COVID-19, but also the impacts of trying to deal with multiple crises. Most of the member states across Africa do not adequately have instruments for disaster risk management, disaster risk financing, and disaster risk responses. And so we find then that there's even less space, public spending I'm talking about, to help small-scale farmers cope and adapt to this changing climate. And with that, because the agricultural sector is risk and highly exposed to risk because it's rain-fed. So because it's rain-fed, financial institutions, and I think Katya will go into depth, are not actually able and willing to take those risks. So at the fund, we are trying to see how we could actually create vehicles that would crowd in the necessary finance, not only at household level, but right through value chains for all actors. So that includes small and medium enterprises. That also includes transporters, logistical services. That also includes consumers and what their needs are. So we have seen landscapes, wholescapes, foodscapes across the continent. So the hotspots, we have now a new 6 hotspots in East and Southern Africa. Mentioned the Horn, there's one in Mozambique, there's also one in Southern Africa where the groundwater is drying up. This is due to climate change, the repeated cyclones that was already discussed. And so at the fund, we are trying to see how we can crowd in as much needed adaptation finance as possible. We have different instruments. We are looking at national risk insurance instruments, working closely with Africa Risk Capacity. But we are also looking at working with private sector financial institutions to try and provide SMEs with access to green financial products that will help them to invest. And unfortunately, we have seen the terrible devastation that the cyclones have done in Madagascar. That means the infrastructure that is needed for trade, for agriculture, that actually incentivizes small-scale farmers to invest in new technologies for higher productivity, being affected. And so that makes it even more expensive to transport food from local locations to others. The majority of the member states are importing large volumes of food, which they could actually replace and shorten supply chains, particularly with COVID. And so we are very worried. The larger trends are that the population growth has outstripped the ability of Africa to produce food. If we do not invest in regenerative agriculture, that Irene mentioned and talked about in her introductory statements, that would be able to restore carrying capacity of these landscapes, then we see degradation of soil, basically reduction of groundwater, and actually whole landscapes which will not be productive. And so our challenge is collectively here is how are we going to upgrade and change the systems and the ways that we produce food for the African continent, given looking at the Sahel and looking at other places, that they will not be able to meet their food balance needs. And so, and also in addition to that, we would need to understand better where the food production surpluses are across these countries and try to be able to move food, fresh food adequately to those food deficit zones. And I think there's one thing finally to say about the rising food prices, because of course, the impact of conflict and drought, degradation of natural resources also leads to conflicts at local levels. So we are all challenged as development actors, the UN, to start programming with a conflict lens on, and maybe increasingly with a climate lens on, and increasingly with the women lens on. Women form the backbone of the farm labor workers in the continent. They're ill-resourced, they don't have access to mechanization. Many are also semi-literate and also financially not very literate. And so how are we going to work progressively with this task force, because they're the ones that work, if we don't introduce and leverage digital to empower them to make the decisions about the seeds and the foods they should produce, because they're the ones who are actually doing the work. And so really empowering women to be able to make decisions, empowering them to be able to be mobile, increasing their mobility, because cultural and structural barriers limit, and in patriarchal cultural settings also limit their ability to do this, and also ownership of land, I think, is key. So let me stop here and hand back to you. Okay.
Thank you, Sarah. It's a incredibly broad systemic challenge. As much as we talk about the acute effects that we know that the women that we're working with are feeling on the local level, but I think your points really bring home that this is such a complex and interconnected web of challenges that we can't afford to necessarily approach this in silos. It's going to really take holistic investments from the financial system, both the public and private sectors, from people who are experienced in gender lens investment and in reaching women specifically, and from the agricultural sector as a whole, to think about how we address this huge array of logistical and economic challenges and being able to adopt more regenerative and sustainable farming approaches. And I think we'll get into what some of the details around that will look like shortly. You know, in thinking again about the impacts at the local level, Irene used a phrase that I thought was very powerful. She mentions that we're seeing that the lives of these women smallholders are the very foundations of their lives are being really shaken by the effects of climate change. And I wanted to ask Jack, from his perspective at MicroLoan Foundation Zambia, if you're seeing that, if that feels true to what you're seeing amongst the clients that MicroLoan Foundation is serving.
Thank you, Rokaya. So it's interesting from the earlier speakers in terms of the number of challenges that they have already highlighted on issues that are affecting women on the ground. I think we can really go in depth in terms of other many issues that we have to overcome when we talk about servicing women in agriculture and making sure that they are increasing in productivity and they are gaining the technology. But aside from those, the issue around climate change remains one of those major compounding issues that is being added to the many issues that have already been attributed to. And in the case of MicroLoan, these are kind of scenarios that we are having to encounter literally on a day-to-day basis. And one recent example that I would like to illustrate here is, I think from some of maybe our members in the audience that are coming from Zambia who will agree that in our last season, we already could see some of these impacts of climate change. Our normal rainy season pattern is around about November, but in some parts of the country last year, we could only begin to see the rains in some cases as late as January. And we provided some of our women beneficiaries already with some loans, and at some point we needed to go back and start renegotiating the terms, because clearly if your rains were initially projected for November and your loan was agreed to follow that normal rainy season pattern, and if the rains don't come on the agreed or on the expected period, surely it means that you really have to redesign the financial services that we are provided. And lucky for us, in many cases, we had to extend to actually match what was pertaining on the ground. But such are the examples that we can give that some of these women have to face on a daily, day-to-day basis. And once predictability of the rainy season is not, in the way that it is expected, it threatens food security. For many clients who would not have had proper information, it means they planted some of the seeds. And what if the rains don't come, it means those seeds were clearly not usable, and were not, maybe someone had to replant their fields again. These are issues that we are facing with women, especially when we work in rural areas, trying to bring to them the attention, the need to also understand on how they can better adapt their farming methodologies or approaches to begin to suit these changing patterns in climate. And I think, Rokaya, if there will be time, I will talk a little bit more later on this kind of intervention in farming that we think are useful to train the women on so that they become a bit more resilient on the effects of climate change and other negative issues around those such communities. I will end and up for now here and hand over back to you.
Great, thank you, Jack, and we'll certainly come back to that point. I think you referenced something that I wanted to ask Katya about, which is about redesigning financial services to better serve women smallholder farmers, especially as we're going through moments of such extreme weather and agricultural stress. And Katya, I know that you and your team have been working with MicroLoan Foundation in Malawi on a new product that has specific applications for this that you referenced earlier in your introduction. I'd love it if you could share a little bit with the audience about this project and why it's important from your perspective to addressing the kind of challenges that women are facing in the agricultural system.
Sure. Yeah, thank you very much. I think we indeed really consider this project as very important, as I think it responds to a number of the challenges that we have already heard that have been mentioned by the other speakers. So this project is addressing those challenges in a pretty unique way, I find. So let me just say that the overall objective of the project is to improve the livelihoods of smallholder farmers through greater agricultural productivity, while also, relying on more sustainable practices of natural resources. And the project is funded by the GIZ, the Deutsche Gesellschaft für internationale Zusammenarbeit, and it is a technical cooperation measure under the Water and Energy for Food project that is actually funded by the German Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development. But let me maybe come back to the objectives and how we are going to reach them. So I think we are going to, together with MLF Malawi, going to develop a loan product that is ESG compliant, that is digital, and that is an individual loan product. So maybe let me spend some time to build on those three terms a little bit more in detail to also show what we are going to do. So together with MLF, we are going to define investment purposes that are ESG compliant. ESG means environmental, social, and governance. So environmental in this regard means measures that are decreasing carbon emissions, that are reducing air and water pollution or deforestation, but that are increasing biodiversity, energy efficiency, amongst others. Social, I think in terms of social, we are probably more looking at human rights as well as labor standards. So child labor, obviously, one issue to mention here, and governance then also relates amongst others to bribery and corruption. So I think for the agri sector here, we are probably looking at environmental and social purposes. So that could, for example, mean that together with MLF, we are agreeing to finance drip irrigation opportunities. So we already learned that agriculture in the region is primarily rain-fed. Or we are going to potentially, finance measures or ways that is actually protecting crops from excessive rainfalls during the core growing seasons of the crops when there shouldn't be any rain. Or we might be agreeing that we are also going to, or MLF is going to finance equipment that is particularly women-friendly or is particularly applicable to tasks that women tend to do in the agri sector, so weeding, for example. So in that regard, the product will be compliant. It will be digital, meaning that clients, and in this particular case, it's to a vast majority women, do not have to travel to branches of MLF Malawi to either disburse this or to get the money and to get their loans disbursed or to repay their loans. So this disbursement or repayment will be done either through mobile phones or through agents. And this will help the women, but also MLF alike, I think, to reduce transaction costs, reduce their carbon footprint, people do not have to travel anymore. At the same time, it is particularly, I think, referring, or is particularly convenient for women because they can bank whenever they want to bank, and they don't have to rely on public transport. When is the bus going? They don't have to rely on the branch, on the opening hours of the branch, but they bank whenever it is convenient for them. So that, I think, is already a huge empowerment. And when we speak of individual, I think this is actually largely a result of the great impact MLF had to date. So I think their clients have grown just as the institution has grown. So you might know that the vast majority of MLF loans are group loans, but for those specific purposes, having an ESG compliant loan product, it might be more purposeful to really have an individual loan product, as the loan amounts might be a little bit larger than typical smaller scale working capital loans, for example. And I think in this particular regard, then we are really going to also increase financial inclusion of women. And yes, so I think we as Frankfurt School have high ambitions to making this project a success. I tend to say that I think MLF Malawi as well as GIZ do share those ambitions. So yeah, I really hope that we will have the opportunity to maybe report back to you next year in a similar event and to really outline the impacts we have been able to generate to date then.
Oh, thank you, Katja. We'll look forward to holding you to that. And I think it's really exciting, in particular, the digital nature of the loan that you mentioned, to a point that I think Sarah made in her remarks earlier. You know, we know that not only are women playing an outsized role in subsistence farming and the agricultural backbone of Africa as a whole, but we also know that they are disproportionately, of course, financially excluded, and that the fact that it is often so hard for them to have the access to reliable financial services only compounds the access to finance issues that are underlying many of the challenges in moving towards more sustainable agricultural practices as well. So it would be really interesting to hear how that product goes as we get a little bit further with it. And I'd like to really turn at this point, you know, I think we've touched a bit on some of the financial interventions that would support making this transition, but it would be great to explore in a bit more depth some of the actual agricultural changes as well that can help develop more sustainable farming practices as well. And Irene, I wonder if I could call upon you to talk about this a little bit. You've mentioned conservation farming a few times in your remarks. Can you tell us a bit about what conservation farming is and if it really works or not?
Thank you very much again, Rokaya. I will talk about conservation farming, but also other agroecological practices so that we show some of the linkages and synergies. So conservation farming is a farming approach that is premised around 3 principles. The first principle talks about reducing the disturbance to soils in order not to expose the soil. And by so doing, we then reduce the processes that lead to loss of organic matter in the soil. And the second principle talks about maintaining a permanent soil cover so as to protect the soil from adverse climatic conditions and also, for example, from wind. And within the first principle as well, where we reduce soil disturbance, we also then use approaches to land preparation and planting that are compatible with our conservation agriculture. So the farmers open up only a very small part of the land to plant the seed directly without exposing a lot of the soil. The third principle touches on mixing and rotating crops so as to increase diversity. And by so doing, then we create synergies among the different crops. For example, some crops can fix nitrogen and have the capacity to bring in atmospheric nitrogen into the soil to make it available to other crops that do not fix nitrogen. These principles under the smallholder sector, I think some of them, yeah, they are quite difficult for some farmers, depending on the situation. So this is where innovation also then comes in. For example, if farmers stop plowing their land as they normally do, what can they use then to plant their seed? So there are different options. They can plant in basins using hand hose, but this is quite time consuming, although it is spread over a number of months during the dry season. It also then maybe spreads the labor, but there are other options like using a jab planter or using ox-drawn or animal-drawn equipment or direct seeders that plant the seed directly without opening a lot of the soil, or using tractor-drawn implements. Why I spoke about diversification, this is in a very broad sense because we need to manage risks. So with more crops, if one fails, there's a chance that another crop survives. But also, like I said, to bring in the benefits of growing different crops, some of them, apart from the nutrient content that I talked about, they can also help to harbor beneficial insects, which help to control some of the pests attacking crops. The central point around conservation farming also is to ensure that we build the health of the soil. But let me touch on one aspect that might be controversial to some people. When farmers plow, then they also destroy the weeds. So this is one way that they can help to control weeds. So if they do not plow, they need other means to control weeds. And sometimes conservation farming then promotes the use of herbicides to control weeds. And this might have some environmental challenges. So how can we find alternative ways that are still effective and efficient for women and other farmers to be able to practice conservation farming? I would like to bring in the aspect of organic agriculture, which is also premised around similar principles, but then it excludes the use of synthetic pesticides, in which case then farmers are relying on local resources. They make or prepare their own concoctions for controlling pests, but for both conventional and organic farming, for both conservation farming and organic farming, the build-up of soil fertility is important. So the use of manures like green manures, the use of agroforestry species, which also bring in a lot of biomass or a lot of prunings, which help to enrich the soil, is very important. And through this conservation approach, we also then increase the soil's capacity to absorb more water or retain more water, or to harvest more water when the rains fall. I think some of the issues relate to the capacity for farmers, because it is knowledge intensive. There is quite a steep learning curve, and it is important that proper training over a long time and backstopping is provided to farmers. And this can be provided through various mechanisms, for example, through farmer field schools, or having lead farmers within communities who are then training other farmers to facilitate networking and also learning together as a social capital. Establishment of demonstration plots within communities is very important in order to show farmers that conservation agriculture, organic agriculture can work within their own context, because sometimes farmers are worried that these technologies do not perform well in their own contexts. I think another issue to really emphasize is that when we do not disturb the soils, we help to keep the carbon in the soil, and this also reduces the contribution of agriculture to greenhouse gas emissions. It is not enough to just train the farmers on how to practice conservation farming or organic farming. They need markets for their produce. They need to be linked to sustainable markets. So within FIBO, we also have a good component on linking farmers to markets through participatory market development, which brings in the stakeholders along value chains to the same table so that they can discuss and explore opportunities together. It is important to note that the work around CA or organic agriculture also then needs to be fed into decision-making and policies. So as FIBO, we also try to develop materials that talk to policy makers, but also ensure that we have generated evidence towards the topic. And this helps practitioners such as farmers or extension staff in the local communities or managers and other leaders to also take into consideration the evidence for their planning. And yes, thank you, Rokaya. I hand over back to you.
Thank you, Irene. I think that's a really helpful overview, and I'm particularly struck by the point that you made that it's not enough to just provide training to smallholder farmers about how to move to conservation or organic or other sustainable farming practices. I think, as we've heard multiple times in this panel, it really extends to a much broader network and infrastructure of support for making these shifts. And I wonder, Jack, if you could speak from your experience at MicroLoan Foundation Zambia to the kinds of interventions that you're seeing being successful as our clients move to more sustainable practices, but also where that additional support is needed.
Thank you, Rokaya. So I would agree totally with Irene's contribution that, when we talk about providing intervention to women, it's not really one approach. It has to be a multi-dimensional type of approach. A lot of things are involved. And with MLF, what we are doing here in Zambia, particularly when we are promoting conservation of farming methods, we are actually working with a number of stakeholders to ensure that various components that are required are being delivered from different perspectives and by the experts that need to do that work. I must add here quickly, Rokaya, that we've been implementing this conservation of farming product for a couple of years now. And some of the lessons that we've learned have really been very helpful to help us improve our approach in terms of how it's administered. Initially, we approached it internally 100%. This means we were involved in farmer identification, farmer training, sourcing of the inputs to provide to the farmer. And quickly we realized that wasn't really the way to do it. And eventually we started identifying appropriate partners to help us with different aspects of the project. And that allows us as MLF now to focus in one single area where our key competence and strength is, and that is providing financial services. So some of our partners are involved in training the farmers. Some of our partners might be involved in providing markets, which Irene has already mentioned as a key component in ensuring that whatever intervention we are making are indeed sustainable. But we don't have to do all these things alone as MLF. We collaborate, we are working with partners. And as a result of some of this collaboration, I want to quickly highlight here one of the success stories, and I hope that our moderators will be able to share this story with the audience. In 2021, RUFEP, which is a department under Ministry of Finance in Zambia, did a case study survey to understand how the different intervention by partners are actually impacting on the women. And I'm happy to mention here that MLF client, one of our clients in Chipata, Miss Anna Lungu, was identified as being one of those farmers that has really achieved much more crop improvement as a result of the approach that MLF takes when it comes to working with the women. So my emphasis here is that whatever that we do from MLF perspective is that it cannot be done in a single institution. It does require a lot of collaboration, different stakeholders working, bringing different skills together. And in our case, one of the things that we want to make sure we do is to ensure that there is always finance available to the rural farmer, to the women in terms of agriculture, and providing that support at any time when it is needed.
Thank you so much, Jack. And I know we're coming relatively close to the end of the hour. We are going to save a few minutes for audience questions. So if you have any, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll come back to those in just a minute. Just to round off the discussion before we move into that period, I'd like to build off of Jack's points and the experience that he's seeing at MicroLoan Foundation in Zambia, and ask you, Sarah, from IFAD's perspective, how you're seeing that compare to some of the work that IFAD has been doing in Malawi. I know you have a really significant portfolio, and that you've also, in conversations that we've had, highlighted that really collaborative and holistic view that's necessary and able to make sure that interventions are having that transformative approach that we're seeking, and would appreciate hearing a bit more from you about that.
Thank you, Rakaya. In Malawi, since 1960, temperature has increased by approximately 0.9 Celsius. So basically, this translates to the number of days, 30 plus and 41 days considered hot. So we have seen intensity and frequency in the magnitude of floods and droughts, basically as a cause to climate change. So this basically has farmers have been facing an unprecedented dry start to the 2021-22 production season, rainfall volatility, multiple storms. I think you all heard about Tropical Storm Anna, Bastry, late January, and particularly affecting crop yields, significant losses with huge infrastructure damage, particularly with big impacts in the southern part of Malawi. So even though we have our operations in Malawi that run between 5 and 6 years, you can actually see the volatility in the programming and planning that our portfolio there has had because of climate. And even though IFAD has raised its basically gender ambitions, so we have committed at the very global level that we would want to ensure that every portfolio has at least 25% of its operations being gender transformative. And of course, 80% being gender, let's say, mainstreaming. So we're really upping our ambitions in terms of gender transformative approaches. So what does that mean in terms of IFAD? Essentially, it's looking at, we have a very specific approach called the Gender Action Learning System, the GALS for short, and it tries to address structural power imbalances affecting women and men, and which prevent them from really, making the most of the opportunities and their potential on only a household level, but also in markets and participating effectively in business. So the approach aims to bolster the economic potential of households and increase the chances of sustained goals and changing economics and incomes It tries to look at the different gender roles, the stereotypal roles, and tries to effectively identify opportunities for both men and women to, for instance, reduce and share the workload at household level, share decision-making in a much better way for joint investments, whether it's on-farm or off-farm, also in terms of medical, and also share in asset ownership. So what is the experience so far? So in a transversal nature, our operations seek to promote access to climate information for all small-scale farmers that we serve in Malawi. This is really, we're using the Participatory Information Climate Services in Agriculture, PISCA, format to provide this essential climate information. So for those who are dependent on rainfed, they know exactly when to plant, not to plant, when to harvest, etc. So this tool in strengthening the backbone of climate information provision and using also digital is one of those, let's say, natural and subnational tools that we use. We have the Program for Rural Irrigation Development, PRIDE, the acronym. That's where we have crowded in what we're calling climate smart infrastructure in terms of irrigation. So we're actually transforming, de-risking small-scale investments and actually opening up multiple seasons for harvesting. So they no longer depend on just one season for harvest, and they're actually harvesting 3 times a year. So the incomes that we have seen for women and men in small-scale farmers on those schemes have been really transformative. And we are saying that with that, basically their coping skills, their cropping intensities, and the way that they do their crop mixes are being optimized on that. Also in PRIDE, we are also looking at diversification. I think that was mentioned before. So we are looking at promoting beekeeping. It's also a means of incentivizing the preservations of water catchment areas in forest lands. And if you cannot try and link, and we need to program that a lot better, the environment nexus with restorative approaches. So by promoting beekeeping, which is off-farm activity, and investing in that, in apiaries, this also encourages the communities to stop cutting trees and having a knock-on effect on groundwater. And so I think it was mentioned before, demonstration plots and actually just revitalizing the village-based advisor and actually linking those to agro-dealer systems, which allow for actually more supply chains and building commercial access to agricultural inputs, which are important for soil fertility management. The Sustainable Agriculture Production Program, SAP in Malawi, has had quite interesting impacts. More than 60% women have participated in this particular operation, more men than women. And we've seen things like the voice and decision-making change for women. So we've got now female extension workers, village facilitators. So there's some increased capacity and participation of women. There has been more equitable workloads. When you look at gender-sensitive labor-saving agriculture technologies that we have introduced in those communal areas, we find that this is liberating more time for women to be not only more productive on the land, but also to participate more actively in markets and have access and control over income. And we have also seen here that women are able to lead in producer groups. And this we've seen as transformative. And perhaps the final point I would talk about is the Financial Access for Rural Market Smallholders and Enterprise Program, FARMSI, that has aimed to transform gender relations from not only an economic empowerment perspective, but also looking at the root causes of gender inequalities. So there, what we have done is actually tried to reduce barriers to like collateral that is required for women to access loans. We've introduced digital, basically enabling them to have a digital footprint, a digital identity, to build a track record, a credit record, which has allowed them to also access other forms of finance and also improve their financial literacy. So there we have actually seen women adopting machinery, which is relevant for them on the land. And we've actually also been able to give them access to land tenure, so certificates that they can use to access land. And we've also been promoting positive masculinity by engaging men in certain co-joint workshops. We're using the program level Women's Empowerment Agriculture Index to measure the results on that. So back to you, Rokai.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Sarah. That's incredibly impressive to hear in terms of the achievements in empowering women. I know those issues around access to collateral and to land rights have been so pervasive and so challenging in terms of being able to build towards true empowerment. And that's really fantastic to hear that that's really moving the needle as we look at broader approaches to empowering women throughout this. So thank you for those amazing examples. I think we've had one question come through in the chat that I think I'm guessing might have come in response to the program that Katia was outlining earlier in terms of the digital product that is being developed with MicroLoan Foundation Malawi. So maybe Katia, I'll ask you to address this, and Jack, you may also have some thoughts. The question is generally around how we mitigate risk by ensuring that loans are spent as intended. Katia, do you want to start by speaking a bit to how we're thinking about that?
Sure, I think that indeed is a risk that the funds are used for other purposes. I think there are various ways to mitigate those risks. Of course, I think one is for larger loans to, for example, disperse loans in tranches. So, you start to disperse the first tranche, you go and visit the client and see if the loan has been used for the intended purpose. So I think this is one of the ways to really also ensure that loan funds are being used correctly. Well, in the right purpose, if you want it like this. I think I would here in this regard also stress the importance of monitoring throughout the loan period. So after disbursement, it's always good to maintain contact with the client, be it directly or indirectly. And my second point was, right, so particularly when you look at investment loans, you might, as a financial institution and working in the agricultural sector, and you're providing funding for investment purposes, you might anyway want to collaborate with the very esteemed or very established supplier of this machinery or equipment. That also has to do with concerns over maintenance, quality of the product. But so you as the financial institution might not have to disperse the loan to the farmer. So the farmer takes the money and goes to the equipment provider to buy let's say the tractor. But you can already kind of disperse the loan directly to the tractor, to the machinery dealer, so that the loans are really used for the purposes foreseen. Jack, maybe you have other experiences or to add, please go ahead.
It's really a complex question, and it all depends on the model, the environment, and in circumstances in which one is operating. And in the case of microloan, because of the type of loans that we give, they are generally small and they're normally given in a group arrangement. We use a lot of community approvals for us to get certain level of comfort that the loans will be directed. So when we are assessing these women groups, there's always a recommendation that comes within the leaderships in the village. And in addition to that, at a different level, we also, which is what Sarah has mentioned around, credit scoring of client. Over time, as we work with the farmers, we are collecting very vital information on the utilizations of the loans. And this comes back in the way that we approve the next loans for the farmers. So the farmers somehow begin to develop the discipline to understand that loans are required to be used for the intended purpose. So it's not really a direct answer per se, because it actually depends on a number of variables, the kind of models that are being used, the types of loans that are being given. But in the case of microloan, as I've indicated, because of the size and because of the models that we adopt, we really have been able to address such kind of risk relatively easily because of all the other factors around us. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And it looks like we've had one more question come in that hopefully we have time to sneak in. The question is, how can organizations like each of yours on the panel work in a more interconnected way so that we are developing more holistic approaches to providing solutions what do we need to do to be more involved to drive towards that more effective change? I'll open it up to whomever would like to begin there.
Yes, thank you, Raka. I think I mean, climate change is monumental, and I think it does require engagement, as you have rightly highlighted, private sector, foundations such as MicroLoan Foundation, government. It requires a collective stakeholder, basically, a response. And sometimes it can be very difficult to have coordinated efforts to come to the fore. But I believe that there's four or three big things that probably need to change in terms of how we respond that would be of interest. So for now, we want to de-risk investments really in the agriculture sector as a whole, and how we can attract other types of funding to do that, particularly private sector funding. And so working together with Katia and others who can mobilize, whether it's guarantee schemes, whether it is other forms of de-risking that we all have experience with. This could be one way of attracting the resources. In IFAD, we're also trying to work directly with the private sector, providing senior and junior loans to encourage them to invest directly in these countries so that we can actually have production locally. Another issue is to look more at national financing models and schemes for disaster and investment. So looking at national insurance, encouraging small-scale farmers to have crop and livestock insurance schemes that will then allow them, in the face of shocks by climate, to be able to reinvest and quickly take up productive activities. So that's one way that will complement what Jack was talking about in terms of direct loans. If they do have this risk insurance cover, that would be very helpful. I also think the conservation actors and scientists that Irene talked about, the scalability of those solutions is very, very important. And being able to cost natural capital is very important. I think markets need to change. Policymakers need to really come in and be able to pay for the true cost of food. And this is, and true cost of food also looks at water and nature, and incentivize small-scale farmers to be able to actually adopt those technologies and grow food in a regenerative way. My final point on this is that we are now working with, for instance, sustainable fiber. So working from the market backwards at the global level, in the case of Lesotho, for instance, and working with the private sector who was looking for sustainable fiber, building operations that promote sustainability, that can really increase the margins that wool and mohair goat herders and keepers will earn once they adopt and are recognized for sustainable ranching and decarbonization, zero emission dairy and livestock systems. So I think being able to connect market players, consumers, and develop vehicles that actually trace and allow for traceability, and then really protect farmers' incomes and incentivize that system right across Africa will be critical as the next generation of operations that institutions like IFAD and all of us around the table should be promoting. So back to you, Rukaya.
Can I maybe just
Rukaya, okay,
Yeah.
if I may add to what Sarah has said, we find that investments towards sustainable agricultural practices is usually much more limited compared to programs which are focusing on short-term gains. So I think there's need to really rethink about investing into practices which help the farmers themselves to be resilient, but also generate community level benefits. For example, if we take to scale conservation farming and organic agriculture, we can help to increase biodiversity or help recharge water to the ground, and also reducing carbon emissions. And these are societal level benefits which are benefiting not just the farmers who are practicing, but everyone. So I think there's needs to have a more participatory and transdisciplinary approach to programming, and also continue to put evidence to those in decision makers so that they can see the benefits of investing in both short-term and long-term programs.
Maybe I can just go back to what Sarah also said. I think you absolutely rightly said that climate change affects us all basically, and I think as the same way, I think also agricultural production affects us all. As you also said, I think there's this very nice word of from farm to fork. Yeah, so I think, and this is indeed, I think, somehow how we could better align and how we also could, all win, so to say. So I think setting up partnerships along the agricultural value chain, involving, backwards, forward, upstream, downstream actors, I think is core. And I think in this way, everybody can also play on his or her or the institution's strength. So I think we would have banks funding, maybe in a first round of trials, farmers, and then they go on to also finance the processor. At the same time, we've also learned that it's not only access to finance that farmers need, it's also access to knowledge, and the demonstration fields that we have is actually nicely coming together in a value chain approach. And we have indeed examples where we have a large group of stakeholders active in one value chain, but just to not be misunderstood, I think it also takes time. So that's probably not the way to start to say, okay, everybody, we are now going to work on this together. But I think it is really an approach that also needs to be developed over the couple of years for specific value chains.
Yeah, I mean, like everybody's saying, Rukaya, we can do more with collaboration. I think we cannot overemphasize that. And as already demonstrated, we need each other. I mean, still more needs to be done. Collaboration on insurance, collaboration on other things is the way to go for us to make much more impact with the women farmers.
Thank you so much to each of you. I think these are really important points, and really what I'm coming away from this conversation understanding is we all have our core competencies that we work on within our professional organizations. We simply can't afford to ignore the linkages between these core competencies, the opportunities to work with each other to strengthen all of our respective portfolios and develop a much more integrated and systemic way of approaching these huge challenges that affect not just the smallholder women farmers that we have been talking about specifically today, but us all, because as many of our panelists have noted, these issues of climate change and food security are ultimately relevant to each and every one of us. And so it's an area where we will have to be deliberate and persistent and very cooperative in the years ahead. Thank you so much. I know we have gone over, and I really appreciate both our audience and our panelists' time. I take it as a great testament to the conversation that we have actually gone over. If there are any questions in the chat that we didn't get to, please do feel free to reach out to us, and we're happy to follow up to make sure that we address them. Once again, I'd just like to thank our incredible panelists for their time and their generosity in sharing their insight and their expertise with us here today. I mean this very sincerely, that it's been a privilege for me to be a part of this conversation, and we truly appreciate your joining us. Thank you also to those of you in the audience who have taken the time, many of you from your evenings, to be here. And I'll end by just noting that, as many of you know, MicroLoan Foundation is a registered charity in both the US and the UK. We truly rely on donations to be able to continue to serve the women that we work with and help provide them with pathways out of poverty. If you're able to consider supporting this work, we would be really grateful if you could take a look at the donation links that I think appear in the chat and make any contribution. We look forward to speaking with all of you again in the weeks to come, and thank you again for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.